welcome to a Firstpost POV. Just a couple of days ago, there was a survey that was conducted in around 9 or 10 countries in Europe. And the results were quite surprising because almost half the people who responded to that survey said that they saw President Donald Trump of the United States as an enemy of Europe. Now, this was extremely surprising for people because the Europeans have always considered the American president to be the leader of the free world and a very close friend. Yet almost half of all Europeans said that President Trump was an enemy. Recently, President Trump sat down for an interview and it became very clear why. He called Europe a decaying power and a power that was slowly becoming irrelevant in the world. He also said that NATO countries apparently call him daddy because that's the sort of importance that America has in this alliance. Joining me now to discuss President Trump's statements and what it means for Europe is Volker Stanzel, who's the former German ambassador to China and Japan and a retired German diplomat. Thank you so much, sir, for speaking to us on Firstpost.
Happy to be here.
Let's talk about why President Trump may have said what he did. Is there any strategic thinking in which his comments are rooted in terms of US and its transatlantic relationship? Or is this more about the culture war that we are seeing playing out in America, where Trump and his supporters seem to think that Europe stands for everything that his campaign does not, whether that's a multiracial society, whether that's relaxed borders, and perhaps a bit of an open and woke culture? Is this about strategy or culture war?
It may very well be that we will have a transposition of the cultural war of the United States into Europe and into the relationship between the US and the US allies, which are not only European countries. But before we discuss that, I would point out that it should be very interesting to find out who is thinking is actually behind what Trump has said, because that is what we found in the newly written national security strategy paper. We know that Donald Trump doesn't really understand foreign policy strategies or even globalization, economic globalization. But we know that he longs for the lost greatness of America, the golden age. That's what MAGA is all about. So maybe someone translated these sentiments into concrete ideas. That is what we read in the national security strategy and what then we heard from Donald Trump himself when he spoke, as you quoted him. Now, about this question you put, is it a cultural war? First of all, I think Donald Trump wants, or the national security strategy wants to underline that the US is fed up with its traditional role as kind of a policeman in the world, even though very often this policeman acted on its own initiative, like in the war in Afghanistan or Iraq or elsewhere. But still, it is something that was a drain on the resources of the United States. And that this is too much, maybe a strong feeling, not just with Donald Trump and the people around him, but with all the supporters of MAGA. And that is where I think we have to start our analysis.
Right. Now, motives aside, let's look at what Trump said, which is that Europe is a decaying power. Now, let's look at it objectively. In 1990, the European countries made up around 25% of the global GDP. Today, they make up around 14%. You look at what's happening in Ukraine, Russia and the Americans are basically cutting Europe out of the process. So looking at it objectively, do you think that Europe is a waning power, if not decaying, at least a power that is not as influential as it was a couple of decades ago, but is still struggling to come to terms with that reduction in power?
If you say Europe, you mean the European Union, I suppose.
Yes.
And the figure gave also concern the European Union. Now, if you look at the time that has passed since the European Union was founded, or the European community to begin with, and the EU had to fight and struggle with enormous problems, beginning with creation of the euro itself, creating a new currency. These are the great economic crisis we had in 2008 and 2009. So these were always problems that Europe had to deal with, and enlarging the European Union after peace returned to Europe in the 1990s was a major job. I don't think the fact that Europe faces problems, obviously, is something that is the same as a death knell ringing.
Right. Now, you mentioned the motives as to why Trump may be saying this, and that's a starting point to analyze what his statements mean and what this means for transatlantic relations. There was a very interesting article in The Guardian which effectively said that the Trump camp has found what's wrong with Europe, and the problem is that it's not racist enough. So, is the strategic thinking in Europe that this is all because of politics and Trump's right-wing push, and not because of a broader realignment in American strategic thinking that, hey, we've been supporting your security for so long, it's time that Europe starts pulling its weight and starts securing itself and stop draining our resources? So do you think that this is more of a Trump thing and his political thing, or is this a larger thinking in the US security establishment?
It is very much and mainly a Trump thing, but not only, because over the decades it was obvious that the US has been paying so much more for preparing, making sure Europe and the US are secure in military terms. Of course, for the people who devised the strategies of NATO, there was a reason for the imbalance in money given for preparing Europe and the United States for a military conflict. That military conflict, obviously, during the Cold War, would have been a conflict between the United States and NATO countries and the Soviet Union. So if such a war had broken out, where would the first battles have been fought? Certainly in Europe. Europe, Western Europe mainly, was, or even is still, a kind of glacis that protects the United States. And in return, the United States guarantees the security of Western Europe by arming with nuclear arms. So the imbalance in economic or financial terms had a reason. Of course, the more costly security of Europe got, the more necessary it was that Europe did more of its own, spending more money of its own. And that is why already in 2014 the decision was taken that all NATO countries should at least spend 2% of their GDP for military security with NATO, including the United States, which then increased their part to 3 point some percent. Now, all countries of NATO have meanwhile decided, and this was upon prompting by the United States, to increase their outlay for military security in the NATO framework to 5%. So, I mean, even if you say so far and in the past the US has paid too much, this will not be the case in the future anymore, especially that now we are confronted with a very, very visible challenge by way of Russia's hybrid war, not only a war in Ukraine, but a war already going on against the Western European countries.
Right. How do you think the European capitals will perceive what President Trump is saying? Will they think of it as this is just Trump being Trump, one of the things he said in a rambling interview? Or will they see this as a reality check and as a way of thinking, okay, this isn't just the American president, perhaps there's a larger thinking here, and so it's time for us to reassess our security strategy as well? What would be the thinking in European capitals be after what we saw in the last couple of days?
Yeah, as I said at the beginning, whose thinking is it actually? It may be the sentiment of Donald Trump, but I think people like J.D. Vance, the vice president, or Hexas, or Musk even, who already called for the abolition of the European Union, these people, of course, are very strong in this kind of thinking. And that is why we cannot just leave it aside and say, okay, today Trump says this and tomorrow he will not even remember what he said. No, we have to deal with it in a more fundamental way. And I think it was the Canadian Prime Minister, Carney, who was the first who pointed to this problem and called upon the Europeans that they, together with him, try to devise a strategy how to deal with the problem that we're facing, which means you have to talk to many Americans, not just the Democrats who would be happy to criticize Donald Trump, but with Republicans who have the majority, after all, in Congress in the first place. This is a topic that has to be dealt with. And especially if we regard what is happening as kind of a culture war, then this is even more necessary to overcome this challenge. We cannot tolerate a culture war between allies that have guaranteed together 80 years of peace in Europe and in the United States, and also, of course, in the Soviet Empire as well. That is an enormous achievement, and we would be totally in the wrong if we forgot about this and did not value it as much as it needs to be.
The German Chancellor also said something very interesting after the American national security document was unveiled. He said that it's time for Europe. This is basically proof that Europe needs to double down on its independence from Washington and needs to chart its own course. Where does that project start? Has it already started? And how soon can we truly expect Europe to turn around and say, hey, we're strategically autonomous now. We are not tied at the hip with Washington anymore?
Yeah, we're not strategically autonomous, even though many of us, especially the French and also the Germans, have demanded this. But this is a long-term project. It's much more costly than those 5% of the GDP for NATO outlays. It will be very costly also in terms of organization, also in terms of industrial production of arms. Who will produce what in the future if we do not want to be depending on the United States as we so far are? So this is, as I said, is a long-term project, and it's very difficult. But it's not the only one. Again, looking at this term culture war and looking at statements like J.D. Vance when he was in Munich in February of this year, or Elon Musk now right after the European Union put a fine on X that was 120 billion, so it was a pretty costly thing for him. But behind it, you see the thinking about how do we control what's happening in the digital field? How do we protect the data of individuals? So it's a question of human rights even. And that is, for European countries, extremely important. And that we need to get Americans to understand, even though their economic organization and their feeling about value of privacy, of data, etc., is a different one from ours. But we need that our points of views are respected by the Americans. That is, I think, must be the first steps to overcome this threat of a cultural war.
President Trump in his remarks did rally against all of Europe when he said that the continent is decaying. But the fact is he does have some very warm relations with certain countries in Europe. You look at Hungary and their Prime Minister Viktor Orban, or you look at the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, he seems to have a workable equation with them. So do you feel that that could be the future of this transatlantic relationship, where President Trump cultivates ties with European allies that he personally likes, but as a whole with the continent or with the European Union, the ties start deteriorating? Do you think that's a possibility? Because a lot of people are also saying that you're seeing meddling in European affairs by Trump and his supporters, where they're backing up these right-wing and far-right parties. Do you envision that to be the future of transatlantic ties if this administration continues in this manner in Washington?
Well, the last point that you made is the crucial one. It is not just the personal relationship between Donald Trump and Orban, or with Prime Minister of Slovakia also. That is not the problem. The problem is that already American representatives of the American leadership have begun to support opponents of the government, of the governments in European countries, the right-wing parties. They have supported the opponents of the present chancellor in Germany financially. They support the French rightists. They support, of course, Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom. And this is something that if the Europeans did it the other way around, I think would run into a lot of criticism and opposition from the American leadership. So this is a no-go area. And this is something that needs to be made clear. That's why I think it was necessary that Chancellor Merz, the German Chancellor, made this point.
Now, in a strange and almost ironical way, would you say that what Trump is doing and the statements he's making has been a timely check for Europe? Because under Biden, you had a leader who was doubling down on the transatlantic ties. He was saying America is back. He was supporting NATO. And now you've got a president who's almost the opposite of that. Do you think it was a timely reminder for European capitals that you need to work on yourself and your strategic autonomy? Or would you say that there's still some patience to wait out this presidency and then see what the next one might bring?
No, it was a timely reminder of the problem that we're facing, to which I alluded at the beginning when I said that it's not just Trump. There are many more people in America who think kind of nostalgically about the lost greatness they think America once had, beginning with the Monroe Doctrine all the way to the policemen in the world. And people who miss this, miss America's greatness, and understand that it cannot be as it used to be in the past. But what can it be in the future? It can be replaced, of course, by a working alliance with countries that are in their cultural philosophy, in their thinking about governance, close to each other. That is the world we must try to at least partially recreate. And this is, of course, a difficult job. But without it, we will run into a lasting conflict of the way Prime Minister Carney from Canada already hinted at. This is something that would damage both sides, Europeans and Americans. And it will not help to say, well, the next president will make it all the better. We don't know that. It's better if we participate in creating a relationship between the United States, EU countries and other European countries, and of course other NATO countries, even those outside of Europe, to find back the way back to a working relationship which benefits all sides.
You talk about Europe diversifying its ties and basically finding partners in other countries. I'm wondering what role countries like perhaps China or India or Japan or South Korea have in that. Do you think the geographical distance and the cultural differences would make such a close alliance hard for Europe to work on, or do you think these are being worked upon and there's a future there?
Well, indeed, European countries and NATO countries are exchanging opinions and thoughts about strategy with Asian countries, South Asian countries, as well as Southeast and Eastern Asian countries. So you mentioned Japan and Korea. Obviously, that is happening. We're also exchanging opinions with China, such a powerful country that presently European economy is weakened to a degree that you named the figures of, which means that Europeans are challenged by China in a very different way as compared to the past. Not only economically, but also politically, because China is using its economic strength, for example, the famous rare earths, in order to try to pressure European countries for compromises that are advantageous, economically advantageous for China. But add to this the political side of it. Because China is supporting in so many ways the production of arms in Russia, the Ukrainian war goes on in the way that we are observing it does. And while China is declaring many times that it would prefer peace in Ukraine, it does not use its instruments, it does not use its influence on Russia in order to achieve that objective. So China is, aside from our relationship with the US, an extremely important partner for European countries. And I might add one thing, that China, of course, sees the situation as it exists between the US and Europe. It sees the conflicts that are brewing there, economic conflicts as well as political ones, and as well in the security field. So China is approaching Europe in many ways, using language usually used by Europeans in order to make clear that China and European countries could be very good partners also in order to deal with the United States. Look at what Xi Jinping gave a speech about when Macron just a few days ago visited China, where he said, using your typical European language, that we, our countries together, need to find for multilateralism, which is exactly something that Donald Trump and his people abhor. So why does China explain that this is something that Europeans and Chinese could work on together? Of course, because it would have a direct effect on the relationship between Europe and the United States, something that would not be in the interest of the future development of European countries nor of the United States.
I think it's fair to say there are many moving parts to this story. We are seeing the United States and Europe move apart, and you are seeing countries like China stand on the sidelines and see that happening and obviously hoping to capitalize. As they say, never let a good crisis go to waste. So we'll be seeing how this transatlantic alliance unfolds under Donald Trump. We've still got 3 more years of his presidency left, so rest assured a lot of these statements and documents are going to be coming out. The European capitals better be ready for it. But thank you so much, Ambassador, for speaking to us on Firstpost.
Thank you for having me.
I was born into revolution. I inherited power like a crown. What I delivered was isolation. I built a personality cult that touched every home. Millions suffered hunger under my rule, but no one dared to speak. I ruled from palaces. My people queued for rice. I called myself the dear leader. History calls me something else, the dictator. Who am I?